I just finished Lies of P, and honestly, it was a really great experience.
Is my nose gonna be bigger? That'd be so funny. Imagine just the portrait was. Oh, it is!
Oh
no! That's so funny.
The game's grim interpretation of the tale of Pinocchio really explores the consequences of attempting to evolve humans into something greater. The fast-paced combat and unforgiving world made this Souls-like a rather rewarding challenge to complete.
Not dealing with that. No.
Almost immediately though, these dark themes on human evolution paired with the quick combat system reminded me, and probably many others, of the horrors found in Bloodborne. These two Souls-like share these thought-provoking themes on human evolution, fast-paced game mechanics, and dark unforgiving worlds, but Lies of P fixes or builds upon many of the mechanics that made Bloodborne an annoying experience, which is why Lies of P is the Bloodborne I always wanted to play. Before we get into comparisons, I did want to clarify that the points I'm going to make are based on first playthroughs. Some of these complaints may not apply to people who have gotten good and have 5 characters on New Game Plus 7. But as a person going through a first playthrough, these were the things that I liked that Lies of P fixed and where I think Bloodborne went wrong. So with that in mind, let's get into it. The first thing that Lies of P fixed that made Bloodborne so tedious to play was item allocation. For whatever reason, Bloodborne decided to put 2 crucial combat mechanics, healing and parrying, behind what is essentially a resource paywall. In order to heal, you have to use blood vials, which are a finite resource that I quickly ran out of as a new player. Typically, the main healing source in a Souls game replenishes when a player dies, but not in Bloodborne. No, if you spent all of your blood vials in a difficult boss fight and die at the end, you are sent back to the lamp with absolutely nothing. Instead of being able to hop right back into the boss fight, which is usually the highlight of these games.
What was he? What would he just attack?
You were forced to grind item drops from regular mob enemies or farm their souls to buy more blood vials. This forced grinding completely disrupts the flow of the game, making the experience so tedious. See, I have no problem hopping into a boss fight hundreds of times and dying over and over again until I get it right, but you can't do that when you have no items. It just makes everything very annoying. In a similar yet arguably worse example, the only way to parry in Bloodborne is to use silver bullets, which are yet another finite resource. Parrying, especially in Bloodborne and many other Souls-like games, is a very satisfying mechanic, but it takes a while to learn, especially when each boss has its own timing and combos and things like that. So completely removing this mechanic because the player runs out of bullets immediately lowers the enjoyability of the combat and also lengthens the time it takes to learn parry timing. For these reasons, the fast-paced, rewarding combat system in Bloodborne becomes a tiresome cycle of forced resource grinding. While Lies of P contains a similar quick and snappy fighting experience, this game, in typical Souls-like fashion, eliminates the need to grind resources in order to use basic healing and parrying mechanics. Much like the Estus Flask of the Dark Souls series, the player is able to heal using pulse cells that recharge after every death, allowing the player to get right back into the action. While this is an easy and expected fix, the result is unmistakably a much smoother and likable boss fight loop, which really complements the high-paced combat system. Now let's talk about parrying. I'm a bit of a mixed bag on this one because the parry systems in both games are satisfying in their own way, except Bloodborne's had more problems. Now, assuming you actually have bullets in your inventory so you can parry, in order to successfully stagger Bloodborne enemies with a parry, you have to find the perfect opening instead of the perfect timing. So normally, for parrying in other games like Lies of P or Dark Souls, you're looking for your sword or shield to swat the opponent's weapon away so the two objects have to connect at the right time. However, in Bloodborne, you are looking for the opening during the middle of your opponent's attack so that you can hit them with a projectile that leaves them staggered. And don't get me wrong, Bloodborne does have a very rewarding feeling for parries, but because the parry relies on a projectile, the hitbox and parry window overlap, leading to unrewarding trades. This gray area doesn't happen in the collision-based parry system seen in Lies of P. Now, the Lies of P parry system is interesting because technically the basic parry is actually a perfect block. If you want to parry it, you need the parry ability found on certain weapon handles or a specific boss weapon. And this parry ability does take a Fable charge, which can run out. But wait, Mr. YouTuber, you just complained about the parry mechanic being locked behind a resource wall. Let me show you why Lies of P just does it better. First, Fable charges are rechargeable at the cost of an item instead of health. Yes, Bloodborne has blood bullets that use your health to replenish 5 bullets, but since it costs health, that means you will probably use a blood vial, which means you'll have to go farm blood vials and bullets once the fight ends. Second, the Fable bar recharges during combat. No item farming or health trade-offs needed. Finally, if you do run out of Fable charges or do not use a weapon that parries, you can use this perfect block system that every weapon can do. The problem is the perfect block system doesn't lead to very rewarding outcomes on its own. At best, consistent perfect blocks will break some enemies' weapons, but this can take a very long long and unreasonable amount of time for some bosses. The other option is perfect blocks build the invisible stagger bar that, when filled, highlights the enemy's health bar with a white outline to indicate that the enemy can be staggered now with a charged heavy attack. So the perfect block doesn't lead to an immediate stagger, which is kind of a bummer, but it's better than missing a stagger window because you're taking a quick concussion nap. Thus, while Bloodborne's parry system is extremely rewarding when done correctly, the black and white collision parry system in Lies of P leads to a much smoother and ultimately still very rewarding parry mechanic that complements the fast-paced combat system. Finally, we can move on to bosses. Unfortunately, Bloodborne bosses are some of the reasons the game does not rank highly for me. Most of the bosses have a gimmick or some extreme move that can end the fight immediately, which makes beating the boss more of a relief than an achievement. For example, there is the Witch of Hemwick, which is a glorified game of hide and seek. Like, why? Then there's Mikolash, who challenges you to a game of tag, only to spam mini nukes when you get him cornered. Urgo's Wet Nurse will have you running laps for half the fight as her shadow clones slash at your heels. And then don't even get me started on the actually artificial difficult bosses like Rom and Shadow of Yharnam that just use multiple enemies to make it very tedious and difficult. Honestly, the only fights in Bloodborne that didn't rely on these cop-outs and took actual learning and skill to beat were the Hunter fights. The first phase of Father Gascoigne is actually a great high-speed skill check in the early game. Gehrman, the final boss of the main game, is a high-intensity fight that requires all the skills you learn throughout the game. Almost any NPC Hunter fight outshines a lot of the main Bloodborne cast of bosses. Now, does Lies of P suffer from some of these boss afflictions? Sure.
Oh! Alright.
But not nearly to the extent of Bloodborne. Take the Black Rabbit Brotherhood boss fight, right? This boss is a multi-enemy boss fight, a 4-on-1 even. However, only one of the gang at one time has priority to attack, while the rest will kind of skulk in the background, throwing in an attack only so often. This makes the fight extremely manageable, while still giving the feeling that the odds are against you. The result is a very well executed gang fight, unlike the Shadow of Yharnam. Then there's the King of Puppets, whose first phase is one of those clunky big enemy, big hitbox kind of fights with an overpowered AoE attack. But its second phase, Romeo, is a brilliant fast-paced, high-skill fight. It's like the devs wanted to have something for everyone. For those who like the atmosphere of taking on a huge chaotic creature, they have the big clunky bosses like the Archbishop and the Swamp Monster. For those that like the quick technical humanoid battles, they provide bosses like Romeo, Walker of Illusions, and Luxasia. And I think it's great that they emphasize both cases. So with all this in consideration, hopefully I've explained decently where I stand. Bloodborne in terms of lore and atmosphere is unmatched. Unfortunately, its gameplay and main boss fights let it down in a devastating way. The truth is, I want to love Bloodborne because its world and story blew me away the first time I played it, but it was just too tedious to call it a great game. And then I played Lies of P, and it instantly reminded me of Bloodborne with its terrific themes of human evolution and its fast-paced combat. So if Bloodborne ever gets bailed out from Sony jail and it gets updated to play anything like Lies of P, I think I could finally call Bloodborne one of the best games I played. Till then, Lies of P will be the Bloodborne I've always wanted to play.